Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carol Shires with School Choice Wisconsin. It's 1 o'clock, and so we are going to get started right away. I know you all have busy schedules. This session is being brought to you by School Choice Wisconsin Action. We offer these quality seminars throughout the year, and we're happy to bring together school leaders to network with one another, give best practice ideas on a wide variety of topics. Today, of course, we're going to be looking at EANS. Really, the goals I have for today's session, first of all, is just to facilitate a forum, an opportunity for you all to ask questions. We're not going to have all the answers. We're going to say that up front. We do have some answers. Whatever we don't have, we will pursue answers for you and pull together an FAQ to send out later, hopefully by the end of the week. We'll see how quickly we can get our answers out to you. But we want you to know that you're not alone in this process. I know that this has been quite a ride this last year, and EANS is just another big project for you to delve into. So we want to try to come alongside you. We will be collecting your questions in the chat as we move along. And today we have, I want to first introduce the people on our panel, and my associate Lydia is joining me today. Lydia, wave to them. Lydia joined our team in January, and she's going to be assembling your questions and monitoring the chat for me. But let's start by just introducing our roundtable. These wonderful school leaders, friends of ours that have volunteered to step in and talk about these issues today. And they too would say they don't claim to have all the answers. They're just trying to help everybody maneuver through the process. So Lori, would you start and introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. I am Lori Soffer. I'm the CFO at Mesmer Catholic Schools, and I've been with Mesmer for about 5.5 years. Prior to that, I was in public accounting for 17 years as an auditor of choice schools. So I'm somewhat familiar with most of the school choice funding mechanism, but the federal funds are all new to me too. So I am learning along with the rest of you how to handle it all. We have about 1,400 students at Mesmer, and we're 99% choice students. So most of our money comes from the voucher funds, and we have an allocation. Our preliminary allocation for EANS funds was about a little bit over $1.2 million. So we have a lot of decisions to make.
Great. Brian, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Frank. I'm the Director of Finance and Operations at St. Augustine Preparatory Academy. We have about 1,400 students as well on the south side of Milwaukee, about over 95% choice, very similar to Mesmer, and looking at the same type of allocation or preliminary allocation of just over 1.2 million.
Great. Donna?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donna Benbenek. I'm the president of Catholic Memorial High School in Waukesha. I've been here at Catholic Memorial for about 4 years, and excited to join you, learn with you, and kind of navigate this together. Catholic Memorial has a student enrollment of 560 students. We have 15% of our student base is, we participate in the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program. Our initial allocation was $325,000. So we, what Lori said, she has big decisions to make. We have strategic decisions to make to think about the best way to allocate those funds. So yeah, happy to be with all of you today.
Excellent. And I just, again, want to thank you all for joining and lending a hand for me to host this session today. I really appreciate Lori and Donna and Brian and Lydia coming alongside to make this happen. So with that, we'll dive in. The way the format of this is going to be, we've met and have a few questions that have come in advance, and we will kind of walk through those first. In the meantime, you're welcome to go to the chat and add new questions. Lydia will be in charge of kind of monitoring those. And as we get to the second half of this session, we'll be trying to address those questions. If we have answers, or if we don't, we will let you know and we will circle back with those. So you can feel free to write in the chat and Lydia will track that. But otherwise, we've got some items to start with that we know have been issues already presented to us. So Lori, I'm going to start with you. You've been tracking this EANS guidelines and the guidance really closely, I know. Is it fair to say that it's been evolving?
That is very fair to say, Carol. I would say it evolves daily. And I've been just continuously asking questions, kind of anything that comes to our attention as our school is trying to make the decisions on how to use the allocation. Questions pop up basically every day. So we've been very quick to ask, send an email to the CISA email and get answers as best we can. So, and it's important to remember that it is evolving and DPI themselves are trying to figure it out. The CISA 6 is trying to figure it out. And everybody's trying to determine all the rules because it's just unknown. So we all have to keep working together to get to the answers so that we can make the decisions best for our school and our students.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really, again, that's one of the goals of today is just to realize if you're out there feeling alone, you feel like, man, I can't keep track of all this. You're not alone. You've got a lot of colleagues here around you that are feeling similar. And I think one of the things we can do hopefully is just facilitate some discussion and help one another. So Brian, I'm going to turn to you. Could you describe a bit of your journey that you've had with St. Aug Prep and the EANS program and what's happened with your perspective over the last few months here?
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to EANS, I also oversee our title and then ESSER and GEAR funding. So all these different funding sources have all of a sudden become available, and trying to keep track of what's what. Initially, with EANS, we get this big allocation number, and that's, oh my gosh, what are we going to do with this? And then we start to see a little bit of the guidance. We have that first webinar. And I'll be very honest with everyone, I was extremely skeptical of the program. Some of the things like title transferring at the end of the program, cleaning services not being allowed, were sort of red flags for me. And I didn't really like where things were headed. Fortunately, that sort of started to U-turn, so to speak. I think what I needed to do was collaborate with some schools and also go back to the guidance and figure out who's making these decisions, right? So I went back to the federal guidelines themselves. There's a great FAQ document that changes a lot, as Lori mentioned, but it really outlines sort of, how did we get where we are? Who's responsible for these things? Because you've got the federal government, you've got DPI, you've got CISA, and you're not really sure who's calling the shots. So reading through that guidance has been really helpful for me. I think in addition to that, the spreadsheet that CISA put out with DPI has been really helpful because there's a tie between those two. For every line that's on there, they show which part of the federal guidance relates to that. So more and more, I'm starting to sort of understand how this program is working. And then to sort of echo what Lori said, the EANS inbox that CISA has been extremely beneficial. They've been responsive, if not same day, probably the next day, and very, maybe I'm a little too skeptical of people, but to my surprise, that it's not just been, here's the reason you can, here's the reason you can't. They've been very collaborative and trying to find things that will help us. So my experience has sort of, gone to one end of the spectrum, and I'm sort of turning my way back now. So things are looking a little bit brighter than what I initially expected.
Glad to hear it. So one of the questions that we had gotten in initially kind of relates to this. I'm going to piggyback off of what Brian just shared. So he was saying how he, along with many of you, have been navigating the ESSER and the GEAR funds also. And just to make sure everybody's on the same page here, those funding mechanisms were required to flow through your local education agency, the LEA locally that you work with. And so this EANS funds is a completely different, unrelated federal program. And the federal law actually dictated that the EANS administration flow through the state agency, which in our case is DPI. And so one of the questions that came in was a little concerned, wondering, okay, when guidance first started rolling out for the program, it showed that we were going to utilize WISE grants and through DPI, and some of you, I'm sure, have probably heard of that system. Public schools use it regularly and so forth. And then suddenly there was this abrupt change where we were not using WISE grants, and instead DPI chose to go into a contract with CESA 6, and that kind of started us down this path. And one school leader that wrote to me was just concerned about that. Why did that happen, and is that to our best benefit? And I would really say that I think it's great, honestly. It's too bad that it was a little confusing of a rollout, but nonetheless, School Choice Wisconsin really had a lot to do with that. We're the ones, Jim Bender reached out to Ted Knightsky early on in this process. As SCW and our coalition partners had been meeting with DPI, talking about the rollout of EANS from the very beginning. And all of us were a little concerned, particularly when it came to this idea of vendors and who can you use. And all of us were concerned that if DPI was the one in charge of all of this, that you might have very limited opportunity to use your own vendors. And Ted and his CESA 6 gang are really helpful. They've been helpful for years with the forward exams and offering other seminars for private schools and so forth. And so getting them involved, we felt like was really a positive thing. They are willing to work with you to get your vendors, if possible, on board. The law requires for the public agency to be the one doing these direct services. So you can't have, as a private school, your contract with the various vendors. And they can't change that. None of us can change that. That just is the federal law. But bank shotting it through CESA, I think in the end, you guys, is really going to be extremely beneficial to you. So I hope that helps a little bit in terms of that history. Donna, let's turn to you. What advice do you have for schools, both from a perspective standpoint and just that practical, tangible steps that they could be taking right now?
So thank you. Yes. So there's a couple things. First, with all of these, Brian mentioned, and with all of these different funding, so you were thinking about PPP, then ESSER funds, and now EANS funding, and there's E-rate funding, and there are all these funding mechanisms, and you have to kind of balance them all. So the first thing my advice is, just to take a breath and know you don't have to be an expert right now. Right now would be a great time to start collecting meet with your whoever your either a board or with your leadership staff to start thinking about and go through the list of what all the eligible expenses are and where you might be most effective in investing those for your school. But know that you have time. I think that's the thing that I've talked to colleagues all over the state. And the one thing I just say is we have time. So that kind of the basic timeline that is available. So the past reimbursements are available for expenses from March 13th of 2020 and through June 1st of 2021. And you can start submitting those May 25th. Future reimbursements are for any of your eligible expenses June 2nd of 2021 through September 30th of 2023. And they have to be pre-approved by CESA 6, and they have to be claimed by October 31st of 2023. But you have some time. And I have to say that the CESA 6, if you use their email, I think Brian mentioned it, very responsive, very helpful. So there's a lot of resources for you to be able to go and get some help on some of the technicalities. if you're going to use the direct service category, you can start making those requests as of yesterday. The form is on the website. I would also offer one last piece of advice before I turn it back to Carol. Really make sure you're documenting and you're keeping your paperwork and document invoices, anything that you're going to either seek reimbursement for, past or future, and just keep any of the materials or anything that you purchase. So for example, if you do purchase technology, even if that technology breaks at some point until 2023, I would suggest that you keep everything that's funded by EANS in some fashion that you can have it demonstrate to anybody that might ask how you used your funding. When you upload the receipts, you're going to want to do cancel checks and upload receipts in order for past reimbursements. So I just would keep good data and good records on what you're using the EANS funding for, so that sometimes it's hard to recreate that 2 years later. So my advice is just keep really good records from the beginning.
And kind of a follow-up on that, we've already got a question coming in, items that must be pre-approved by CISA 6. The question is, what do we need to keep on hand to verify this? And I think you'll find that the pre-approval form will guide you. They put it up on the website yesterday on CISA 6 site under resources, and it will guide you through what you need to do. You need to explain what it is that you're looking for, how it relates to the pandemic, et cetera, some brief explanations, and then putting forth, if it's a direct service, you'll have a contract between you and the CISA for that service, and they're going to want to see a copy of that. So I think Donna's overall recommendation is super smart. Keep everything and document everything the best that you can. So if they circle back and ask for more, we'll probably touch on that again with some of the other questions. But Lori, I'm going to move on to you. I know Messmer stands to get a large allocation of funds from this. So how have you approached just allocating all these different buckets and knowing how to best take advantage of these opportunities for these stimulus funds?
Well, and actually I'm going to go back to when the ESSER funds and the GEAR funds we knew that they were going to become available. We started at that time amongst our administrative leadership team and with our principals, deciding what our priorities were going to be throughout COVID, which had nothing to do with the federal funding. But having been in on all those discussions and really listening to people, since I'm the person at Messmer that has to make the final decisions about our budget and how our money is spent, I knew going in that I wanted these federal funding sources, and now EANS, to help us alleviate operating costs that we would otherwise be spending on our list of priorities. So as I've gone throughout the process, I've really been strategic with following the rules of the program and deciding which federal funding source is the best one to use for which expense that we need to spend money on. And now I have, I hadn't done it last year because it was all so new, but in planning for our 21-22 year budget and our 22-23 year budget, I actually have a budget with our total spend, and then I have columns that will reduce our Messmer operating spend for what we use our federal funding sources for. So I'm tracking that very carefully, and I'm still planning and will be planning all the way through the beginning of next school year as to what source is going to pay for what strategic priority within Messmer that we've decided we need to follow through on. So take it from a big picture perspective. And I would advise that you include all the people within your school that need to make the decisions for what the money is spent on. And then, of course, have one person overseeing that to make sure that you are grabbing from the pot of money, whether it be your own operating money or your federal funding sources, to do what you need to do with in my view, I'm always thinking, what is the easiest, the less amount of rules that we have to follow to actually be able to get what we need. And so I'm just tracking it all very carefully. And as Donna said, making sure that I keep all of my documentation in order. So, and remember also, and that when we get the reimbursements, that's money we can use for whatever we do need going forward. So I'm taking that into consideration too. There may be some things we get reimbursed for, some things that then we can use for things that are less available with federal funding in the future to help us alleviate our own operating expenses in the next year or two.
I like that strategy, both the practical advice of having just the different columns that you could take your budget and start to peel off those pieces that would appropriately fit with these other opportunities, EANS being just one actually of several that are out there right now. What about you, Donna? How do you view the EANS funds as it relates to your overall budget?
Very similar to what Lori, I could echo her comments. Certainly looking at what are the eligible expenses, what are the priorities, what are the real costs of COVID and learning loss and some of the challenges that we've been facing. But as Lori said, now we can look at some of the qualified expenses of eligible for reimbursement. That frees up funds that we've already spent this year that we can get reimbursed for that are eligible expenses, frees up those resources now for us to be able to spend on things that still help the kids, still address some of these issues, but maybe are not directly funded through EANS, but by getting reimbursed, it makes other funds in our operating budget now available. So we're looking at that. We're also looking at what are we going to need that is reimbursable for the next school year to operate safely. But that all frees up our regular operating budget to do other things that we need to do for the kids.
Excellent. Brian, I know when we spoke earlier, you had mentioned that your school was looking at needing to make some really large purchases that you were hoping to get reimbursed through EANS, but you were a little bit nervous just in case those items wouldn't be approved by CISA. And then later you'd kind of be stuck holding the bag. So I'm sure that other schools could relate to that kind of angst. I know schools right now are looking at ordering things now. What about you? Can you share some of your perspective? And I know you'd mentioned earlier some angst about that idea that perhaps you have to give stuff back at the end of 2023. And how do you maneuver through that?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. So from my perspective, I'm sort of in a spot right now where I know that we can go back and get past reimbursement, and that money has been spent. So from our team's perspective, we're collecting, as Donna mentioned, a big list of, this relates to the closure. This is devices that we needed to get. So that money is gone and we're kind of compiling that list. Now I'm thinking about purchases that we need to make in preparation for next year, or even just to close out this year. And some of those are large purchases. We're in a school where we have tables set up and we're going to need to move to desks in order to get more students in classrooms. And that's a huge change and a huge purchase. So before I do that, I mean, every spreadsheet that I've seen says, yep, this is okay. But I still wanted to reach out to CISA-6 and say, hey, this is something that I'm going to be doing. I just want to make sure, this type of thing, this is the reason. And if you sort of lay out, here's what I'm planning to do, here's why I want to do it. And the most important thing, here's which number, which allowable expense number it relates to, they'll respond back really quickly with, yep, this looks good. Or, there was one that I was asking them about where they sort of challenged me on it a little bit, but it wasn't like, you can't do this. It was like, find like a CDC recommendation that relates to this, and then let's talk through it. So that's been really helpful for us as we're thinking about the purchases that we need to be making now in preparation for next year. We're sort of in this weird in between where with future reimbursement, you'll get a pre-approval from CISA. So you know ahead of time, okay, cool, this is something that we can purchase. And with past reimbursement, you've already spent the money. So right now we're just in this really weird in between where I think it's good to check that allowable expenses spreadsheet that CISA put out, double check with them if you've got a big purchase, because to Carol's point, you don't really want to get stuck with something. It's good to just double check with them. And then Carol, you also mentioned the title transferring side of it, which was something that to me was a deal breaker. If we have to give the items back 3 years from now, do we want to buy them now to begin with? In the webinar yesterday, they were pretty confident that they would be able to find some sort of solution. I think Laura from DPI said 99.7%, which I'm not a betting man, but I would go with 99.7. And then Carol, I don't know, do you want to talk through sort of that supplies side of it, or do you want me to walk through that?
Yeah, I can touch on that. So when I asked the question and have discussed it with Laura Pincenalt with EANS and DPI, and they're hoping to come out with some clear guidance on that shortly. They just weren't quite ready for that. But I think the direction they're trying to move towards, and this is not soup yet, but this is what I think she's pretty confident that they're moving towards, is a $5,000 limit for what's the criteria of supplies. So things like desks and Chromebooks, we would probably be in the habit of thinking of those as more capital expenses. They are saying with federal guidelines, often those are supplies if they're under $5,000. So they're kind of, tidying up a few little details with that before they make a big announcement. So kind of hold off, give a little bit of time, but I think that's the direction they're hoping they can go. And so there'd probably be very few items that you would reimburse or purchase that would be larger than $5,000 each. Desks, Chromebooks, all that kind of stuff clearly is less than that. And we will talk a little bit more later in terms of other capital expense questions that have been submitted also. Okay, let's see. Lori, I know you have definitely had a great experience reaching out to CISA 6. We've already mentioned them being very helpful. They even offered, sounds like, to do some Zoom individual meetings.
Yes, I've reached out, as I said earlier, on a number of occasions with questions and emailed them, and they have gone back to me definitely in not more than 24 hours, probably less than that in all cases, and typically on the very same business day. Even if I've reached out at like 1 in the afternoon, they've still gotten back to me at the end of the day. And I've been so very encouraged by the meetings that we did. We've had 2 Zoom meetings with them, 2 30-minute Zoom meetings with them as a result of those questions, because they offered right away. And he usually puts up a calendar that has 15, 30, or an hour time slots that you can sign up for. And I've been able to sign up for them within a couple of days. So it's clear that they're making themselves very available to us. And when I have had these meetings, they have been so positive and so favorable. They can't always say yes, but the fact that they listen to what we need, what our school needs, they ask follow-up questions, we give the answers. They're clearly taking notes. They're telling me that they're going to follow up with DPI and they're going to get back to us with an answer. And I know they're doing that as quickly as possible because they've done it a couple of times now within a couple of days. It's been, and I'm with you. I'm with Brian on the skepticism end. I'm very skeptical of everything. And I was especially skeptical of this going in, having come, still dealing with the ESSER and GEAR funds, which has been a different situation than I'm used to in my life. But very skeptical, very concerned with everything. And they've just been nothing but helpful. And they've made it clear. They've stated the fact that they really want to help the schools get what they need to help their students. And they've said it several times, which to me is huge.
Yep, and
It's
that's really why we
just-
wanted CISA 6 to be involved, because we know Ted runs a great tight ship and they are incredibly efficient over there. And I think that in the end, you'll be glad they're involved. One question I know that has already come through both in advance and on the chat relates to the June 1st cutoff for those past reimbursements that's coming up shortly here. And I don't have the answer to this yet, but perhaps one of you on the panel have already reached out to DPI, or I mean to CISA 6 about this. So if you have a purchase, like Brian, I know you mentioned you were going to potentially get a whole bunch of desks. Is it to your advantage to purchase that and have an invoice dated prior to June 1st? Or does the invoice have to be paid by June 1st? What exactly determines that cutoff? Do you know?
So from my perspective, I guess I don't have a clear answer on that. I know in our next webinar with CISA, that's sort of the scope of the meeting. So hopefully we get some clear answers there. But there's a couple of things that I think are worth sort of mentioning when it comes to past versus future reimbursement. With the past reimbursements, I think it's if it's money that you've already outlaid or spent, then you're sort of stuck there. If not, I would definitely recommend checking with CISA if you're going to submit it for past reimbursement. For some of the reasons we've talked about before. The other one that I didn't mention was that there's been a couple mentions of reasonable cost in the webinars. And they've talked about it a little bit, but I think it's just something for schools to be aware of. They're talking about it more from like an item by item perspective, but at the same time, if you have 300 students and you say you're going to buy 800 Chromebooks with your EANS funds, they may challenge that. And if it's something that you submit, but you make the purchase now without any approval and then submit later, it's something that might just be worth checking with them. The other thing that I'll mention on past versus future reimbursement that has been sort of helpful from my side is that CISA's approval will be based on CDC guidance as of the purchase date. So if the CDC is recommending desks today and I make the purchase today, then we're okay. But if they change that tomorrow and I'm waiting for future reimbursement, they may say, well, this is no longer approved because the CDC no longer recommends it. So that's not to say that you need to panic and start doing things right now, but just keep in mind that if the CDC changes something, that may impact EANS's approval process.
That's a great point. I mean, an excellent example of that has been the plexiglass that everybody bought for partitioning early on last year. And if you are looking to get that reimbursed, that rule that Brian mentioned would be employed. So it was a CDC guidance that was approved at the time that you ordered it, so it would be reimbursable. Whereas now, I believe in March, the CDC changed their guidance and said that that was no longer proven to be helpful. Therefore, like future reimbursements here moving forward, if you're purchasing that plexiglass, for instance, as a barrier, that would not be EANS eligible where it was in the past. Okay, so Donna, let's move on to the whole idea of staffing. And one of the questions I know you had was about hiring potentially some interventionists to help with learning loss. Clearly, that's an eligible expense for EANS, but there are considerations around staffing. So let's just talk through that. This is a direct service he talked about yesterday.
So this was an area that was of, I will admit, great confusion for us as we were trying to figure out how you go about providing the support for learning loss interventionists, because the way the rules are written, we can't go hire somebody. That's not like a reimbursable expense. So we can't go hire somebody, choose our candidate, hire them and just have this reimbursed. So because they can't directly pay us, the funds go through CISA. So the method and talking with Ted and the folks at CISA and the process is that you can identify the qualifications for the person you're looking to hire. You can post a position, you can recruit a position, but you want to work with your local CISA, because then what will happen is that they would be an employee of that local CISA. One of the questions that originally what was talked about is that they would then be originally the thought was a contract worker, but with contract, then they don't get benefits, and that we thought was a limitation. So now they would be employed by the CISA. DPI is in the process of creating an MOU, but that they would be employed by the CISA and your local CISA, and they would receive benefits. So it looks like a good solution to being able to get the person that you want. There is a direct service option as well, where CISA 6 does have interventionists and people identified that you can work through them. But so we have a couple options there in terms of how you go about identifying what you need at your school.
Yeah, and I think just to clarify, I think even if you have your own staff person that you want to refer to the local CISA to be hired, technically it'll still be going through their direct service portal or bucket, or however you want to look at that. It's just that you will have the opportunity to suggest that they hire that person. This MOU, they told me last week, would allow the school to have a voice in some of these things that you want to have a voice in. For instance, the pay rate. They won't set that. They will allow you to set that pay rate, but the benefits are what they are for that CISA. You're not going to have any input in that. The employee would get whatever that CISA's benefits are. And just keep in mind that the cost for that interventionist or teacher that you're bringing in through the CISA is the total cost. It's not just their salary, it's their salary and benefits. So whatever that amount is would get charged to your school's EANS account, so to speak. Another question related to staffing, I don't have an answer for at the moment, but I've already reached out, is to get clarity around the credentials. So as you know, in the choice program, you have to have teachers with a bachelor's degree or higher from an accredited university. That's different than in the public realm where you have to typically have a licensed teacher. And so we wanted to get clarification on that, whether we could still have schools refer someone to the CISA as a summer school teacher or whatever the case might be that does not have their license. And so I'm waiting to hear back. That'll be on our FAQ that we follow up with later. Lori, let's move on to some quick discussion about Windows. That has been such a hot topic. I know he talked about that yesterday. Can you help us?
Well, we've all learned through the process of the window discussion, the many Windows discussion, that we can purchase the windows ourselves and then have the labor and installation, or the cost of the installation of those windows, paid for through direct service through this EANS program. We heard from CISA 10 on the webinar yesterday that they're the ones to contact about the window installation. And so you will be able to use one of their vendors, and you would also be able to use a vendor that you work with. But if you want to use a vendor that you work with, you will have to get them added to the approved list through CISA 10, who's working with all the window installation and HVAC, I believe, Windows and HVAC systems. And the same thing for an HVAC system. The EANS funds cannot pay for the system or components of the system that actually get installed, but the labor, the installation, the cost of getting that installed can be covered with the EANS funds. And and I believe you can start that process whenever you're ready, because the portal for the direct services has been opened. So that's all about Windows and HVAC.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not a perfect solution. We all wish that they could just pay the whole bill and give you all new windows. But again, the reason they have to do it this way is because of federal law. So they're doing their best to make it as flexible as possible to help facilitate this. And if you're able to get a vendor of your choosing even, all the better. get that installation done. He made it clear yesterday, if you're going to do a project like that, you need to let your vendor know that there needs to be 2 invoices, one to the school for the actual product and one to the CISA for the installation. And that's how they would handle that. So again, if you have X number of dollars that you were, going to get covered for these windows and you would wished it was more, but it's like, well, you get that, you can apply to something else, just kind of shifting things around to your best advantage. While we're on the subject of capital improvements like windows, I just wanted to clarify several other things that have come in as questions. Furnaces, air conditioning units, any of that HVAC, the same rules apply. They will pay for the installation as a direct service, but not for the capital improvement that's going to stay at your school. You'll need to purchase that separately. Several other items, no touch drink fountains, touch-free paper towels, automatic bathroom faucets, those have all been cleared as items that you could have installed. Same rules apply. You buy the materials, which honestly is usually the smaller part of a project like that. The installation is usually the larger piece. We are waiting to hear back of whether that same rationale holds true for touch-free toilets that flush. The idea again is with all of these items, you're going to need to say why you're doing this related to the pandemic. So just because you need a new furnace, I don't know that that is going to be the justification. If you're putting in air conditioning or HVAC systems that allow for transfer of air, those kinds of things, you could point to that as being helpful for ventilation regarding the pandemic. So just keep that in mind with all of these items. This is a pandemic relief act. It's not just a free-for-all for anything that your school needs. Supplies for cleaning are a definite yes, and janitorial service is a definite no. And people have asked why. I don't know why, but it was written that way in the federal guidance and in the federal, in the actual statute. So for some reason, they put it that way. So supplies are yes, and the janitorial service is a no. HEPA filters are a no. Installation of a custom UV system is a yes. Use the catalog of vendors if possible. Fans would be yes. Fans are considered as a supply. So that one is a clear one. I think circling back to staffing, I want to touch on that a little bit more. We talked about this MOU that will allow DPI, the CISA and the school to be able to kind of iron out, workers' comp and the liability concerns and all that kind of thing would be laid out in this MOU so that everybody knows what's going on. But one question that came in that I thought was a good one was in terms of what if this teacher that you get, they're no longer your employee, they're someone else, the CISA's employee. What if their standards aren't what you want them to be? Maybe they don't follow your ministry or diocesan standards. You run into problems with that. So hopefully this MOU will outline some of the guidance that how you would handle a situation like that. But I know that's a question, if anybody has gotten more clarity and wants to share, that's one that's hanging out there that I'm going to follow up on. Okay, lunch program, disposable items, yes, but not the lunch itself. Transportation, yes, but not just transportation that you would be doing on a day-to-day basis anyway. Again, how is this related to the pandemic? How is this, is it bringing kids to summer school program that you normally wouldn't do, or you're doing with the focus of learning loss? Are you sending extra buses because you want to socially distance the children, take them to multiple venues, potentially? Those kinds of things is what Laura told me they would be looking at in terms of that transportation. So transportation is not just a carte blanche for any transportation. Is it a reasonable cost, and what does it do to facilitate learning loss and issues related to the pandemic? Software, That's a big question that people have. Online subscriptions are reimbursable for remote learning. Otherwise, you need to go through your CISA for other items related to that. And curriculum, let's talk about that a minute. One person on my panel, have any of you delved into that at all with getting different curriculum potentially to help with some learning loss?
We are working on that, and we're told that it could be covered as a direct service, I believe. And also, so we're hiring a couple of our teachers to do curriculum development to address learning loss over the summer. And they're going to contract with the CISA outside of their contract with Mesmer to be paid for that service for us. But it has to be direct service. So that's what I know right now.
And again, when you say direct service, what that means is it's going through the CISA.
Correct. They will contract with the CISA and be paid by the CISA. CISA will not pay us, will not reimburse us.
And one question that came through is just to define what an MOU is. Sorry about that. That's a memo of understanding. It's just going to allow you to get on paper a better idea of the parameters of that employment arrangement and how you as a school, what kind of voice you'd be able to have in it. Outdoor classrooms, that's a question that got asked in advance of the seminar. That's a good question. We're heading into the summer where that could be a good potential opportunity for you. The key there is it movable? Is it a supply or is it a permanent structure? So my understanding of that, again, if you have folding chairs, tents, those kinds of items that are truly more temporary in nature, those are great. Those can be purchased and approved. Again, at this juncture, I would recommend before you go out and buy it, just find the items that you're looking at and run it through CISA to make sure that you have that prior approval. That's the safest way to do it. But the idea is keep it temporary, movable, not this permanent structure that you're going to have years from now. Summer school, kind of along those lines. Yes, definitely as a direct service. You can get teachers, you can refer your own teachers to CISA. You want to have it prioritizing the learning loss because of COVID-19. It doesn't need to be only for kids with that difficulty that's struggling, although maybe that's everybody at this point. But they said that needs to be the priority focus of it if EANS is going to be covering it. Planning for that summer programming, again, use the CISA as a direct service and just talk to your local CISA. If they don't have what you're looking for, most of them are going to be really willing to work with you to do that. Other questions, Lydia, that are coming through?
Carol, if I could interject a question or confirmation. One of the things that had come up in a previous call with the stakeholder group, and I wanted to see if you've heard anything different. You talked about outdoor classrooms. We had asked the question because we hosted an outdoor graduation in August of 2020 as a result of the pandemic. And so, of course, folding chairs and audiovisual that we had to be able to have outdoors in order to get social distancing. And it was at that time, as the response was, yes, that would be something that could be reimbursed. And I didn't know if you've heard any conversation about that or if you would concur with that as kind of in the same line as outdoor classroom space or a pandemic related expense.
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly that. That would make total sense to me because all the guidance, the state guidance, the local guidance, last summer, we went round and round, trying to know what we could do for graduations. And the big thing was if you're going to do it, it absolutely has to be outside, et cetera. So I would assume that would make total sense. I would just recommend with any of those things when you're presenting it, Brian kind of alluded to this too, that when you're presenting those items to the CISA, making your explanation, if you can reference what is that pandemic related reason. If you always have graduation outside and you didn't do anything different, if you don't try to prove that it has something to do with the pandemic, that you maybe spaced people farther apart, you know, whatever the case might be. So Brian, I think that was a really good recommendation, is to just look at those 12 uses, right? That's what you meant. And then just be able to give the number of the correct item.
Yep. Including the number and then also referencing any sort of CDC guidance has been really helpful for sort of getting those discussions going.
Yeah, so we're getting questions in about like iPads and Chromebooks and those things. They are definitely allowable expenses. It's very clear that those are allowable expenses. And the question that we're waiting for clarification on at the moment, again, is at the unit level, they would be basically a supply at this point, whether or not, you know, if you tend to group your items together and suddenly it's many thousands of dollars. So and becomes a capital expense. So we're waiting to hear back with clarity from DPI on that, but it's looking very hopeful that all of those things would be reimbursable expenses moving backwards to last summer and moving forward. It's just that if you're moving forward, you're going to want to talk now to CISA, get that advance approval to make sure that you don't box yourself into something that you weren't ready for. Another question, this is a great one. What a creative question. Would bikes count if the goal is to take PE classes outside? Love it. What a great question. Again, I would take Brian's recommendation and pitch that idea to CISA and explain why that is helpful with the current pandemic situation. It sounds like it could be reasonable to me, but I don't know. Interactive whiteboards, yes, those are clearly covered through the guidance that they've given. Again, it's the same kind of thing where you are covering the installation of that and not the item itself, is my understanding. But Brian, do you know, is that clear with whiteboards?
As far as I've seen, any sort of interactive whiteboard would be covered. If it goes over 5,000, then maybe it would be considered a capital expense, but everything that I've seen is pointing to that at this point.
I'm going to put that one down as one to just circle back on for everybody, to just make sure whether it's the item itself or only the installation of the whiteboards. Okay, so some other questions that have come through. Okay, audit requirements. Oh yes, the beloved audit requirements. Okay, we're kind of going round and round with DPI on this. I have reached out to DPI to have what's called an auditor working group meeting. We're going to be meeting sometime in June here. We're waiting for that to get scheduled to give some clarity to this. SCWA is going to have a follow-up seminar that focuses exclusively on audits and its interaction with EANS. That also will be in June. We purposely have not scheduled that yet because we're wanting to get this other meeting on the calendar so that we can have good, clear answers for you. At that meeting, I will have auditors be a part of the roundtable and they will be answering your questions. What they've told me so far with items that you are getting reimbursed for, those items will be reducing your eligible education expense to the best that we can understand what they're telling us. Their guidance has been a little wonky. The auditors have been kind of confused by it. So I wish I had more clarity for you, but we are seeking to get that and advocating for you in the best way possible. We'll circle back with that in detail in June. Mental health supports, yes. Definitely. That's a direct service that you can apply through your CISA. What else have we got for questions here, Lydia?
There's a question about textbooks and supplies to support learning loss.
Textbooks and supplies to support learning loss. Lori, you want to take that? Whoops, I think you're muted.
There we go. There is the ability, there's online textbooks on the EANS allowable expenses worksheet. It doesn't address physical textbooks on here, and I have not asked that question, but it's under category 12, initiating and maintaining education and support services or assistance for remote or hybrid learning or to address learning loss. Textbooks, online textbooks can be covered by direct service. And it does not address actual physical textbooks or, workbooks. It just doesn't, that's not addressed. So I think that's a really good question to ask. I would think that either online or actual physical textbooks could be addressing learning loss. So I think that's a really good question to actually send off to the CISA 6, the EANS at CISA6.org email, and they will answer it or determine the answer to it and get back to you.
Good, we will add that to our list. What about, I know I saw this on a different seminar, the 3-year subscription for EANS, using EANS funds for multi-year subscriptions. If I believe, if correct me if I was wrong, that Jason addressed this yesterday, that you can go ahead and get the 3-year subscription, but if that 3 years is going to take you beyond the end of the September 2023, then the school would need to take over the end of that subscription, the cost of the end of that subscription. That's how I understood that. Anybody else want to chime in?
That is my understanding as well.
Transportation for athletics. Would transportation for athletics, which were specifically required due to the pandemic, be included? I'm not sure, because I think they would want to know, what do you mean by that athletics specifically required due to the pandemic? If you mean that you were required to practice in a different facility that was farther away or something of that nature because of pandemic concerns, I'm just not sure. I think you're going to need to, again, you're going to need to make your case and describe what it is that was pandemic related that put you in an unusual spot that you need to have that transportation covered. So I don't have an answer for you, but I would just say, if you're going to pitch that question, explain it a little bit more in terms of what that pandemic constraint was. Maybe you had local constraints with your health department, that kind of thing. Brian, Donna, Lori, anything to add with that?
One thing that I think that some schools have had to get twice as many buses to spread the kids out. And I think that's a great point to make as you're sort of going through the approval process, that we needed a bus to get the kids from point A to point B, but then we also needed 2 because we had to spread them out. So I think you could definitely make that case.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that. We are bumping right up against 2 o'clock here. We've got 2 minutes left. In the meantime, if you have other questions to come, just send them to us and we will add that to our list. We will be offering a second seminar in June, and I'll send out an invitation for that. That will focus exclusively on audit questions. Again, always feel free to send me the questions though. Just email me at scw@parentchoice.org. And we're happy to help you. Again, I want to just thank Donna and Brian and Lori. Thank you so much for lending your time and your expertise. And we'll be talking shortly again. Thanks so much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Carol.